This is our 17th session of Hilchot Shabbat. We are in chapter 276 of shulhan-arukh or Haim, 276 Halacha Hey, Halacha 5. In the previous session, we discussed the halacha of not reading with the light of the candle for fear that one might tilt it. And we said that this doesn't apply to an electric light. That is because if one would make that mistake and tilt the candle, he would be transgressing a biblical prohibition. But if one would make a mistake and dim or adjust the light of an electric light, it would be a rabbinical prohibition. So we don't make a gezerah, a decree, for a decree. Gezerah l'gezerah, to avoid, to create offense, to avoid transgressing a rabbinic prohibition. Now, why is a light bulb rabbinic and not biblical? Some say that only LED lights are considered a rabbinical prohibition, if at all. This is another discussion. But incandescent light is biblical. Why is that? Because the wire heats up, and that is considered mevashel. Now, that is a misunderstanding of the way the light bulb works and what mevashel is. Mevashel is a term, cooking is a term that applies only to food. But it was borrowed to apply also to other things. But even that application, one could argue, is rabbinical, and it definitely doesn't apply to the light bulb. Why? Because cooking is changing the status of the object that is being cooked. That's why, as we mentioned before, in bishul har bishul, if you took flour and water, made it into dough, and then you baked it, this is irreversible. You can make the bread back into dough. Even if you grind it, you take matzah and you grind it into matzah flour, matzah meal, it's not flour. You can't really bake it. If you cooked vegetables and you turn them into cooked vegetables, you can't revert them back to uncooked vegetable. The same follow meat, chicken, whatever you cook. Now, with metal, there is a process that could be similar to cooking, and it's called tempering. And this is what the Mishnah speaks about when the rabbis discuss cooking that applies, or the concept of mevashel as applying to metal. They said if you heat something up and then when you cool it down, it is a tempering, it makes it stronger. But that only happens once. The metal doesn't revert back to untempered. Once it's tempered, it's tempered. The molecules lock in a certain way, and that's it. So the incandescent wire within the light bulb repeats the action again and again and again until it eventually burns out, but not because it was cooked to perfection. So even if one, by mistake, would use the dimmer on Shabbat, it would be at most a rabbinical prohibition, and therefore we don't create offense for offense. And we'll talk more about electricity when probably when we finish the shulhan-arukh discussion, and then we'll talk about modern problems. In Halacha Hey, however, the shulhan-arukh speaks about another issue of amira legoy, of asking a non-Jew to do something for you, and that's an interesting saif. It's worth reading it verbatim to get the sense of how Halacha adjusts to changing situations. It says this: be'aratzot karot mutar le'eno Yehudi לעשות מדורה בשביל הקטנים ומותרין הגדולים להתחמם בו. In the cold lands, cold countries, the non-Jew can start a fire for the little ones, and adults could only sit there. So why do we allow it for the little ones? Because they are as minors. It's not considered a transgression of Shabbat. You're doing it for someone who is himself not obligated. Once they did it, once it's done, the gedolim, the adults could also sit there. What if you did it for both in mind? The Mishnah Berurah quotes the shulhan-arukh that it's forbidden. But then, in the very same halacha, he continues to say, "Afilu b'shvil hagedolim mutar im hakor gadol, shakol holim etzel hakor." But even For the adults, it would be allowed to have a non-Jew light the fire if the cold is very strong. Why shakol holim etzel hakol? Even though they're not really sick, but when we talk about cold weather, this is in itself a sickness. They understood that it would lead to illness later on. So even though they don't say it, but this is sort of a preventive measure that this tsar, this suffering that one has when there's extreme cold, the gezerah of Hachamim doesn't apply there. And then he concludes, but those who allow themselves to ask the non-Jew to light the fire, even though the cold is not so that great, this is not allowed. The Mishnah Berurah comments on that, but don't tell them that. Let them do that as shogegim and not mezidin, as someone who does unknowingly and not deliberately. The interesting thing about this halacha is that we see that the rabbis understood the changing situation, and the Mishnah Berurah, who lived in Poland in Radumsk or Radin, in a cold country, knew that you can't tell people not to ask the non-Jew to light the fire for them on Shabbat. And we're talking about something that is considered a biblical prohibition. So here's a clear example of, first, the evolution of halakha, of adjusting to changing situation, and B, of when we come to the halakha of asking an non-Jew to do something for your own Shabbat, that we could be very lenient regarding that concept, because it is all a rabbinical fence. Anything that has to do with telling the non-Jew to do something for your own Shabbat is a rabbinical fence. In that context, I'll mention that 2 or 3 years ago, there was a severe snowstorm in Israel. People were not ready for it. And one of the rabbis who belonged either to Tzohar or Tzomet, one of these organizations in Israel, wrote an article saying that on Shabbat, Friday night, they had a blackout at home, and he decided to lift the switch, the fuse, to bring back electricity, because it was only in his house that happened, because he feared that the cold would cause irreversible damage. The kids were suffering, his little kids, and there was a halachic storm over that in the newspapers and on the internet in Israel, saying that what he did was not right, and many rabbis were against him. But come to think of it and see what the shulhan-arukh says here, that with the rabbinic prohibition, when you have the balance between rabbinic prohibition and hakor, shakol holim etzel hakor, we know that the great cold could cause indeed irreversible damage. People could get sick. People suffer tremendously. Then the rabbinic prohibition do not hold valid in that situation. So what he did was right. He should have flipped the switch. He should have brought electricity back. And that is true also if you have a situation where the house becomes extremely cold and there's no other way to do it. So, as I said, we'll talk about electricity later, but just to mention that the 3 arguments that people use to say that electricity cannot be used on Shabbat is that you either start a fire, or you build boneh by closing a circuit, or that is makeh bepatish, it is you're finishing something whose craft did not end. Just like removing tags from a suit and making it available for wearing. The same thing with electricity. So all these don't hold and that doesn't come from someone who is extremely lenient or anything like that. It's Rabbi Moshe Levi, a student of Hacham Mir Mazuz, in his book Menuhat Ahava. He speaks about that. He says that none of these arguments is valid. The one about fire is not valid because electricity is not fire. Rabbi David Shlush also holds it the same way. The fire is a chemical reaction. Electricity is a physical reaction. It could cause fire. In that case, if it leads directly to the creation of fire, there could be a problem. But it's not fire per se. It is not called construction, because it is something that is not permanent, is not in a building. It's you turn it on and off. You just close the circuit and you reopen the circuit. It's not construction. It's not permanent. And the third one of saying that is makeh patish also doesn't apply, because makeh patish, just like the cause of cooking that I mentioned before, has to be final. The whole idea of makeh patish is finalizing work that was not finished, was unfinished. For example, you have a table that cannot be used because you have to chip off a certain corner, or shoes that let's say plastic shoes that come connected together at the sole with the plastic piece that you have to cut in order to use. That only happens once. Once you did it, it does not go back. It does not revert back to the previous situation. Makeh patish could only happen once for one object, for one element. So we can't say that every time that we flip the switch we are makeh patish. So bottom line, electricity on Shabbat, unless it leads directly to the creation of fire, is rabbinical and not biblical. In the case of great cold, we said one is allowed to use it. In the next session, we'll discuss the in Siman 277, the halacha that one is allowed to basically put out a candle by putting a bowl on it. Interesting, mentioned in shulhan-arukh, but it's based on a Mishnah that we read every Shabbat, every Friday night, and we also talk about the idea of reading the parasha twice in Hebrew, once in Aramaic. So that will be the next time. For now, have a great day and a wonderful week.